Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video and thank you for your support. I wanted to make a brief clarification right quick. In all honesty, I know that not all white people are racist. It's just that's what this country, I don't know if it's what they want us to believe, because you got to realize that while they're messing around and disenfranchising Black Americans, they're also mind effing you too, white people. They're not, they mess with you too, because they want you to have this constant disdain towards Black Americans. And when you look at it, if you go and just deal with yourself, you'll realize, you'll wonder, what is the disdain all about? Okay, it took me all this time to realize that when you say racism, the reason why, white people don't recognize racism in this country is because it's not racism to them. It's not racism to them. It's a way of life. The way this country has treated Black Americans for centuries. I'm not talking about, this hasn't been going on for a week, a month, a year. It's been going on for hundreds of years. The way this country treats and regards Black Americans is a way of life. It's not, it's nothing, it's not unusual, and in some of their minds it's not wrong, because this is how Black Americans are seen. They regard Black Americans as second-class citizens, inferior, and will never be any more than a servant. So when you call them racist, they might put on a song and dance in public. Oh my God, no, I would never be racist. But in their hearts and in private, it's like, I'm not racist. This is just how it is. I was making a comment on one of my videos, and the guy, I basically said that in a comment, that it's not racism to the ones who are racist, because that's, in their minds, they're not being racist. They're being who they are, and they're treating Black Americans how they feel they have a right to treat them. I made that comment in general to someone, and he came in and basically like, yeah, that's how he said he grew up in a conservative family in a predominantly Hispanic community, and he said that was basically the consensus. That was the mentality they had towards Black people. I don't know if he was just speaking about his family having that mentality, or the family and the community, but he said it was disturbing and disgusting how they would talk in private. It's been ingrained in white Americans to be racist, whether they want it to be or not. Doesn't it seem like this country is set up like the movie Groundhog's Day when it comes to Black Americans? If you've never seen the movie, never heard of it, just do a quick search. The main character of the movie found himself waking up to the same day over and over again. Nothing got better or worse, except with Black Americans, things have gotten worse. I was going to say that in regards to this recent election, presidential election, Biden didn't promise Black folks anything, but I had to search. That's how disinterested I was in the whole thing. But I had to do a quick search, and I found out that he did promise Black people something, and he didn't deliver. Can't you see that it's a setup, Black folks? They've been doing this since they've begrudgingly extended you the so-called right to vote. They promise you the moon, stars, and sky above. Then they end up giving you nothing. And you have to wonder about these Black politicians and Black local leaders who keep pushing you to support these people, knowing they won't honor a word that came out of their mouths concerning you. This brings to mind what Malcolm X said.
The Black people should band together and do something about selecting and electing representatives, Black representatives, politically, who have the rights and the the best interests of the black people at heart, and that we should also unite together and sweep out of office all of the black political puppets who are used by the white power structure to continue white supremacy in our communities.
No, I'm not a studier of all things Malcolm X. I just happened to stumble across some great points he made. He made these points back in the early 60s, and you're still seeing them well and alive today. Okay, let's get into this. Woodrow Wilson, I call him Wicked Woodrow Wilson. Wicked Woodrow Wilson was the prominent American scholar who served as president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910, as governor of New Jersey from 1911 to 1913, and as the 28th president of the United States from 1913 to 1921. That man was in office for 8 years. Somebody liked him. And they say he was the most racist president, right? But why did he stay in office for two terms? While Wilson's tenure is often noted for progressive achievement, his time in office was one of unprecedented regression and racial equality. Several historians have spotlighted examples in the public record of Wilson's racist policies and political appointments, such as the segregationists in his cabinet. Other resources note Wilson defended segregation on scientific grounds in private and describe him as a man who loved to tell racist, darky jokes about Black Americans. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born and raised in the American South by parents who supported the Confederacy. His father, Joseph Wilson, supported slavery and served as a chaplain with the Confederate States Army. Wilson's father was one of the founders of the Southern Presbyterian Church in the United States after it split from the Northern Presbyterians in 1861 over the issue of secession. Joseph became a minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Augusta, and the family lived there until 1870. While it is unclear whether the Wilsons ever owned slaves, the Presbyterian Church, as part of the compensation for his father's services as a pastor, provided slaves to attend to the Wilsons' family. According to Wilson, his earliest memory was playing in front of his yard as a 3-year-old, hearing a passerby announce with disgust that Abraham Lincoln had been elected president and that a war was coming. And I'll try to remember if I can remember things when I was 3 years old, like playing in the yard and somebody walked past the yard saying something. No, I couldn't remember. I don't remember. Let's continue. Wilson was an apologist for slavery and the Southern Redemption Movement. He was also one of the nation's most foremost promoters of Lost Cause mythology. Lost Cause of the Confederacy, or simply the Lost Cause, is an American pseudo-historical negationist myth that claims the cause of the Confederate States during the Civil War was just heroic and not centered on slavery. Let me continue. At Princeton, Wilson used his authority to actively discourage the admission of African Americans. Prior to entering politics, Wilson was one of the most highly regarded academics in America. Wilson's published works, an area of scholarship focused on American history, though this fact received less attention both during and after Wilson's academic career. Much of his writings are overtly sympathetic towards slavery, the Confederacy, and Redeemer movements. One of Wilson's books, History of the American People, includes such observations and was used as source material for the Birth of a Nation, a 1915 film that portrayed the KKK as a benevolent force. Quotes from Wilson's History of the American People used for the movie included the policy of the congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilian nation in the South in their determination to put the white South under the heel of black South. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great KKK, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. However, Wilson had harsh words about the gap between the original goals of the KKK and what it evolved into. I would like to know what the goals were. I really don't. No, I don't. Let's continue. Congressional Government, another highly regarded civic publication of Wilson's, includes a strong condemnation of Reconstruction-era policies. Wilson refers to the time period as being characterized by congressional despotism, a time when both states' rights and the system of checks and balances were disregarded. Wilson specifically criticized efforts to protect voting rights for African Americans and rulings by federal judges against state courts that refused to empanel black jurors. According to Wilson, congressional leaders had acted out of idealism, displaying blatant disregard of the childlike state of the Negro and natural order of life, thus endangering American democracy as a whole. In his lengthy works on American history, Wilson did not cover the institution of slavery in great detail. However, when he did discuss the issue, his views were apologetic towards the institution, at least as it existed in the rural South during the antebellum period. Wilson described himself as an opponent of both slavery and the Confederacy, though based solely on the grounds that neither would, in the long term, prove beneficial for the Southern economy. And I'm trying to figure out, if this country isn't racist, how did you guys elect a man with this mindset for 8 years to be president? It's something to think about. Let's continue. The idea that holding another human being in bondage as chattel was inherently immoral is absent from any of Wilson's discussion on the subject. On the contrary, Wilson described slavery as a benevolent state for Negroes whose white masters looked after their comfort and welfare and meted out justice fairly. Why did they run away? Why did they risk their lives to run away? Why did they risk being maimed, being beaten damn near to death if their white masters took care of them with comfort? See, don't he come across, those who want to be honest, don't he come across like he was the only child and he spent a lot of time alone and wrote fantastic fiction at 5 years old? Let's continue. According to Wilson, domestic slaves received affectionate and indulgence from their masters. Though Wilson admits some masters could be neglectful, he maintained that by the large slave owners acted responsibly and dutifully towards their inherently indolent field slaves who often did not earn their keep. So working from sun up to sundown, that wasn't earning their keep. See, didn't I say, don't it seem like some white people, if black people aren't working their fingers to the bones, they're lazy? Oh, do you have any scrapes or cuts on you? No? Okay, well, you wasn't working hard enough. Let's continue. In 1902, the Board of Trustees of Princeton University selected Wilson to be the school's next president. Wilson invited only one African-American guest out of an estimated 150 to attend his installation ceremony, Booker T. Washington. Though most accounts agree Wilson respected Washington, he would not allow him to be housed on a campus with a member of the faculty. Such arrangements had been made for all of the white guests coming from out of town to attend the ceremony. Wilson also refused to invite Washington to either of the two dinner parties hosted by him and his wife, Ellen, on the evening following the event. Despite these reforms and being generally viewed as a success in his administrative role, Wilson used his position at Princeton to exclude African Americans from attendance. What else needs to be done for you guys to see systemic racism? To those who want to keep denying it, what else needs to be? I've come with receipts, as they say. I've done videos after videos to show you systemic racism. You still denying it? Let's continue.
I mean, this man, before he even became the president of the United States, he disenfranchised black people. Now imagine what he did when he became the president, and I will get into that.
Let's continue. At the time, opportunities for higher education were limited for African Americans, though a handful of mostly elite northern schools did admit black students. Few colleges and universities accepted black students prior to the 20th century. Most African Americans able to receive higher education did so at HBCUs such as Howard University, but by the early 1900s, virtually all Ivy League schools had begun admitting small numbers of black students.
Does affirmative action come to mind yet? Remember, they made a big deal, Asians made a big deal out of affirmative action, saying, oh, they want people to go to school on their merits and and intellects, and it's here's the thing. You see, I just read how few schools allow black people to come in. Hence, that's why they had to come with affirmative action, because you had racist institutions that fought black people tooth and nail. If they were fair and didn't fight black people at every turn, they wouldn't have needed affirmative action. And yes, black people are very capable, more capable. They would outdo the white students when it came to academics and intellects. But they still needed affirmative action because some people just don't let things go. But I hope those who came against affirmative action, I hope you reaped everything you sown.
Let's continue. In the years leading up to Wilson's tenure as president of Princeton, the school had taken baby steps towards integration, with a small but slowly increasing number of African Americans permitted to study at the graduate schools in varying capacities. Wilson did not immediately put an end to this practice, but he refused to allow it to extend or expand, and only one African American student received a degree during his tenure.
See what I'm talking about? See how this one man interfered in a black person's livelihood? That one man. Now imagine when you have hundreds and thousands and millions of people who have the mentality that Wilson had. And then you still want to say there's no systemic racism? Now you have you have corporate America, and you have these people with the same mentality in corporate America, the same mentalities in colleges and schools, the same mentalities in the government, same mentality in the medical field, same mentalities in every sectors in this country. You see what I'm talking about? Systemic racism. All it takes is one person to hurt a person.
Let's continue. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt appointed William Crum, an African-American Republican, as a customs officer for the port of Charleston, South Carolina. Wilson, like many white Southerners, bitterly opposed Crum's appointment based on his race.
They didn't like him because of his race.
Let's continue. During his remarks before a Princeton alumni group, Wilson made a vulgar joke, the punchline of which called Crum a coon, saying that President Roosevelt will put a coon in it. During the 8 years that Wilson served as president of Princeton from 1902 to 1910, his perspective on race does not appear to have evolved. Campus facilities remained segregated, and no African Americans were hired as faculty or admitted as undergraduate students during his tenure. In 1909, Wilson received a letter from a young African American man interested in applying to attend Princeton. Wilson had his assistant write back promptly that it is altogether inadvisable for a colored man to enter Princeton. Wilson eventually came to include in his justification for refusing to admit African American students that Princeton had never done so in the past, though he knew such claims to be false. By the end of his time as the president of Princeton, Wilson had taken steps to erase from the public record that African Americans had ever attended or instructed at Princeton, though neither was true. Princeton College did not admit a single black student until 1947, becoming the last Ivy League institution to racially integrate.
And here's the thing. This is what I say to people all the time about statistics. It's mainly white people that come up with statistics. They'll want to come and base their facts on statistics. And I tell people all the time, I learned this by someone that that is wise and I respect. They told me years ago that statistics are, they're man-made, of course, and they're biased. That a group of people could come together and put these numbers together. And do you know that in order to make something a fact, you have to, you can't base your statistics on interviewing 5 people and then say those 5 people represent millions of people. And to me, that's what statistics do. Because if you haven't went around this country and spoke to every black person, interviewed every black person, you can't generalize. And statistics to me are a generalization. They're a false, biased generalization. So this man, he intentionally went and erased the history of African Americans in that college. They already said, he claimed that there were no African Americans that attended the college. They said he lied. So my point is, if he can go in and manipulate the records to make it appear that no black people attended that college, what else can people do?
Let's continue. Before the election of President Woodrow Wilson, black Americans worked at all levels of the federal government.
Here's where I say he effed up black people's lives, and this is one man. Now imagine what hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, and millions of men and women with his mentality can do to a whole group of people for decades and centuries.
Pay close attention. Let's continue. Black Americans worked at all levels of the federal government, but when Wilson assumed office in 1913, he mandated that the federal workforce be segregated by race, leading to the reduction of black civil service workers' income, increasing the significant income gap between black and white workers, and eroding some of the gains black people had made following Reconstruction.
You got the point I made? This was only one man. I'm going to keep reiterating that. This was only one man. And look how he came in and jacked up these black people's lives. Some of them probably never recovered from what he did to them financially. Not to mention how it brought so much stress and degradation and frustration in their lives and their families when he cut their income.
Let's continue. During Woodrow Wilson's 1912 presidential campaign, he promised African Americans advancement. He stated, "Should I become president of the United States, Negroes may count upon me for absolute fair dealing and for everything by which I could assist in advancing the interests of their race in the United States." Doesn't that sound familiar? Don't they always do that to you black folks? Aren't you tired of being effed around with, lied to, played like you the dumbest group of people on the face of the earth? Let's continue. Believing in his promise, As usual, many African Americans broke their affiliation with the Republican Party and voted for Wilson.
Jesus, God, what is it? What is it? Why is it so easy for black people to trust those who don't look like them? But when a black person comes, that Jack charlatan, you better get your nigger self away from my porch.
Let's continue. He even caught the attention of prominent African American activists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the NAACP and publisher of the Crisis magazine, and William Monroe Trotter, a prominent and vocal activist and publisher of the civil rights newspaper, The Guardian. He did not, however, fulfill promises he made during the campaign to the African American community during his presidency. Less than a month after his March 4th, 1913 inauguration, President Wilson's administration took the few steps towards segregating the federal service. Wilson's policies and personal racism dashed the hopes of Du Bois, Trotter, and many other African Americans who had broken away from the Republican Party, or in Du Bois' case, the Socialist Party, to vote for the Progressive Democrat. And they still play the same. They got a blueprint. Hey, you want to get the vote of black folks? Yeah, how do I do that? Just promise them a little bit. Just throw them a few tokens, and they will run and support you. Thank you. Good looking out. Let's continue. The question of federal segregation was first discussed in high administration circles at a closed cabinet meeting on April 11, 1913. At the cabinet meeting, Postmaster General Albert S. Burleson argued for segregating the railroad mail service. He was disturbed by whites and African Americans working in the railway mail service train cars. The workers shared glasses, towels, and washrooms. He said segregation was in the best interest of the African American employees and in the best interest of the railway mail service. Burleson's ultimate goal was not only to make the railway lines lily white, but to segregate all government departments. President Wilson replied to Burleson by saying that he had made no promises in particular to Negroes, except to do them justice. He argued that he wished the matter adjusted in a way that makes the least friction. While President Wilson expressed no direct objections to Burleson's segregation plan, support came primarily from other cabinet members. Shortly after the April 11th cabinet meeting, cabinet members Treasurer Secretary William G. McAdoo and Postmaster General Albert S. Burleson segregated employees in their departments with no objection from President Wilson. Segregation was quickly implemented at the Post Office Department headquarters in Washington, D.C. Many African American employees were downgraded and even fired. Employees who were downgraded were transferred to the dead letter office where they did not interact with the public. The few African Americans who remained at the main post offices were put to work behind screens out of the customer's sight. The segregation implemented...
Oh, wait a minute. I have to say something. I have to make a comment on that. You know when you go in certain businesses and you don't see not one dark person there. You don't see not one black person there. The whole floor is filled with white people or Latino people, but anyone but black. They still practice the same thing today.
Let me continue. The segregation implemented in the Department of Treasury and the Post Office Department involved not only screened off working spaces, but separate lunchrooms and toilets. Other steps were taken by the Wilson administration to make obtaining a civil service job more difficult. Prior among these was the requirement begun in 1914 that all candidates for civil service jobs attach a photograph to their application, further allowing for discrimination in hiring practice.
You see black folks who are fighting, who are sincerely fighting for reparations, you continue to fight. And you go drudge up all that wicked history that was against you and included the federal government, like whole presidents that discriminate and governors that discriminated against you. That is systemic racism. You have the government, aka president and governors and mayors, disenfranchising black Americans. That is systemic racism.
Let's continue. At the same time, the Railway Mail Association, representing the railway mail workers, refused African Americans membership. In response, African American railway mail workers created an organization that is known today as the National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees. Among the efforts that NAPFE is best known for is their protest against the use of photographs for identification in civil service examination.
See, Hispanics and Asians, when you got an issue with black folks, you see how that helped you out, because they discriminated against you too. Let you apply for something and they see this Asian picture or a Latino picture and see if your application is going in the trash.
Let's continue. The alliance began that protest in 1914 and continued until it was finally eliminated in 1940. As soon as the Wilson administration implemented federal segregation, individuals and groups began to lobby against the administration's policy. Congressman John J. Rogers of Massachusetts introduced resolutions urging for the investigations of the treatment of African American employees in the Post Office Department and other federal departments. Each one of these measures, however, died on committee calendars. Groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Independent Political League also lobbied against segregation. The NAACP led protests and letter-writing campaigns and gained the support of some whites. In response to NAACP protests, Wilson replied the department's segregation was in the interest of the Negroes.
Here's the thing. What you guys don't realize is that you had whole presidents and governments participating in racism. And they were willfully, knowingly violating the Civil Rights Bill of, 1868, 1865? They willfully violated that law that your forefathers wrote. But everybody else has to follow the law.
Let's continue. In 1913, a group of African Americans led by the National Independent Political League petitioned the White House. The group met with President Wilson and was assured that segregation had not been decided upon as the administration policy. After this meeting, the group was optimistic. Later that year, however, when a group of white liberals and African American leaders suggested the administration create a national race commission to grapple with the Negro place in an expanding American democracy, they were disappointed when Wilson rejected the plan. Many individuals concerned with the segregation implemented by the Wilson administration blamed only Wilson's cabinet members, primarily Burson and McAdoo, but not the president himself. They argued that since there was no executive order implementing segregation, Wilson could not have known about it or been in favor of the policy. Wilson was, however, aware of the policy being implemented by members of his cabinet. He, in fact, approved of segregation plans and vigorously defended the segregation policy in personal letters to NAACP Board Chairman Oswald Garrison Villard. In his letters to Villard, Wilson said that the segregation of the African American employee in the department was not a movement against Negroes. He argued,
"We are rendering them more safe in their possessions of the office and less likely to be discriminated against." But they were discriminating against him. God, that man, they needed to study his mind. That's what they needed to do.
Let's continue. In other words, to Villard, Wilson said that he favored segregation because it provided African Americans with freedom to advance in their own. circle.
Without the money. See, segregation would have been fine if y'all didn't mess with the monies. But when they segregated, they not only divided races, they took the money with them.
A practice that curtailed advancement of African Americans in society. Wilson also revealed his support for segregation in a letter to the editor of the Congressionalist. He stated, "I would say that I do approve of segregation that is being attempted in several of the departments. I certainly would not have if I had not thought it to their Negroes' advantage and likely to remove many of the difficulties which have surrounded the appointment and advancement of colored men and women." Wilson's failure to address Jim Crow disenfranchisement, his decision to screen Birth of a Nation at the White House in 1915, his dismissal of African American activists, and most notably his administration's active segregation of the federal government together helped to further cement the systemic racial injustices that define American life in the 20th century. When Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912, Washington, D.C. was home to a flourishing black middle class, with African Americans making up nearly a third of the city's population. Still, racism and inequality plagued the nation's capital as it did the rest of the country, with neighborhoods, schools, and private institutions segregated across the city. The federal government, however, had been integrated in the early days of Reconstruction and continued to be so up to Wilson's arrival at the White House, making up at least 10% of the federal workforce. African Americans, federal workers, had the professional opportunities and resources to build a network of thriving, though segregated, educational and communal institutions in Washington, D.C. With the new Wilson administration, all that changed. As president, he reinstated Jim Crow in Washington, D.C. after the city had gone a long way toward ending it. He did not limit himself to just the nation's capital. He ordered the elimination of all senior positions in the federal government where blacks supervised whites. One of the federal officials Wilson arranged to have fired was a black customs inspector living out his last years in Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Smalls. As historian Eric Yellen explains, segregation did not simply separate black and white workers in the federal government. It halted black professional advancement and restricted hiring in the desirable positions for which these men and women were qualified, having passed the requisite civil service exam. Though Wilson did not officially direct the implementation of these segregated policies, he welcomed them under the guise of the argument that it would reduce friction among government workers. But as William Monroe Trotter put it, just before Wilson kicked him out of the Oval Office for protesting these disgraceful policies, "We appeal to you to undo this race segregation in accord with your duty as president and with your pre-election pledges to colored American voters. We stated that such segregation was a public humiliation and degradation and entirely unmerited and far-reaching in its injurious effects." When Wilson moved to the S Street House, he brought his love of modern entertainment with him. With little mobility in his final years, he inherited a film projector from a DC movie theater and had a large screen installed in his library where he took in the newest Hollywood films. And yet his love for film was also the center of one of the most prominent racist controversies in his presidency: the private screening at the White House in 1915 of the racist propaganda film D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation. The film, an adaptation of Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, offered a wildly historically inaccurate tale about the Reconstruction era that depicted the North and African Americans as aggressors and glorified the KKK as the South's righteous saviors or redeemers. Many have credited this narrative with fueling the resurgence of the Klan after World War I. Wilson promoted the film not just out of loyalty to his college friend, but because Wilson himself was an avowed white racist, white supremacist, who even by the mores of his time held black people in the sort of a racist contempt that even his gracious manners, urbane sophistication could not hide. After the screening, Wilson was quoted as having declared that the film was like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is all so terribly true. As a PhD historian himself, Wilson's words lent credence to this racist false understanding of American history. Contemporary historians continue to debate whether Wilson actually uttered this now infamous line. They agree, however, that even if he was quoted inaccurately, his own historical writings reveal that he shared the film's harmful racist misreading of history. What is more evident suggests that despite the fact the quote had sparked anger and protest from the NAACP and from many civil rights leaders, Wilson declined to disavow the words attributed to him. The film screening has persisted as a central controversy in Wilson's legacy as revelatory of his racist ideals. At the same time, however, this movement was also central to the history of the civil rights movement, as black and white civil rights activists organized in protest of the film and in public condemnation of Wilson. As President Wilson can rightly be credited with a number of achievements, he was in his day, and indeed even in the context of our times, a progressive. He was also a man born into a family that benefited from slave labor, whose theologian father preached that God commanded black people to be slaves, and whose vast education never disabused him that black people were his inferiors. That belief led him to visit incalculable pain and hardship on millions of people at home and abroad, when among other things he had U.S. Marines occupy and establish a system of forced labor in Haiti that in effect reinstituted slavery and the very first republic to have abolished it back in 1803.
See what I said about one man? How one man can damage a whole, can just do so much damage.
Let's continue. In the end, it doesn't matter terribly much whether Princeton removes Wilson's name. He did destroy a generation of black middle class, and he did take away a freedom Haitians have fought a war of dependence to earn. And yet, it should scarcely be surprising that an American university would choose to name a school of international affairs after one of its former presidents who, among other achievements, saw the country through World War I and was an intellectual architect, precursor of the United Nations. What I have to say briefly, my closing, is, you know how it's one thing that irks me that this country does, this world does. It doesn't matter how vile a person could be, they will always try to go and pull out their good characteristics, if that's even possible. Yeah, they might have been a mass murderer, but he did teach a couple of youths how to read. That don't mean nothing. The Bible, for those of you who read the Bible, those of you who don't, I'm not talking to you. But the Bible says the kindest deeds of a wicked man is still. Whenever white America point out the wickedness and flaws of someone white, and then they come back and try to say, but hey, he was a progressive president, that don't mean anything to the people that he harmed. They don't care about him being progressive. He ruined their lives. They said it. They said he destroyed a generation of the black middle class. Then he went back and in ways reinstated slavery in Hades. So there's nothing you could do to clean up this man's character. Nothing. I'm sure people still suffering from what he did. And 1913 wasn't that long ago. I know y'all want to believe it was. When it's something bad, you always want to say, ooh, that was you say 2 years was a long time ago. When it's something bad. All right, thank you for your time. I'm about to close this up. Thank you for your time, attention, and support. Be safe and have a good day. See you in the next video.